upstate New York. So I spent most of my summers as a kid coming up here and camping and spending a lot of time in the Adirondacks. So I fell in love with the region, and then when I finished my master's, it lined up that I could start here. My title for working for the Adirondack Center for Loon Conservation is I'm our Stewardship and Outreach Director, which is a whole slew of things that I cover, but one of them is obviously presentations. So that's why we are with you today. So the Adirondack Center for Loon, oh my goodness, good start. Adirondack Center for Loon Conservation is a nonprofit organization that started in 2017. Our executive director has been doing research on loons in the Adirondack region since 1998. So we're not a new mission, but we are a new nonprofit itself. But our mission is dedicated to inspiring passion for and promoting the conservation of Adirondack loons. And so as an organization, we obviously study loons. We're predominantly a research organization, but in the last few years, we've expanded to include a lot more education and outreach activities through our work. So the reason that we study loons, besides the fact that they're really cute and fun, so what that means in the ecological world is that we're able to see small changes that are occurring throughout the entire food chain because they are, with pollutants such as mercury and other things that we see in loons to accumulate in ecological systems. And so as you go up the food chain, you're going to see more of those effects. And so that's one of the best reasons to study loons. They're also incredibly territorial. So they obviously will defend their own territory. And in addition to that, they return to the same territory, as I'm sure many of you know. We have a lot of people who go out into their lakes and they've been monitoring the same loon for 20 years. So it is a really good way to get long-term monitoring data as well on individual loons, as well as the populations themselves. So this is an example of them being territorial. This is what we call, this is what we call the penguin dance. So this is an example of when either a human or a loon or something else is threatening them, and they just do this up. So what you're hearing. But we'll get into this. Lived, as I kind of said a precursor to. Originally, we thought it was around a 20 to 25 year time of lifespan, but now we're thinking that it's closer to 30 and 35. So they are really long-lived species if the situations are correct. There was recently, I know, and some of you have probably seen it, but there was recently a loon that died in Vermont that was one of the oldest known loons, and it was 31. So it's really important that we're continuing to study these and see how these individuals are responding to environmental conditions. In addition, in New York, they're listed as a species of special concern, so they're not endangered, they're not threatened. They've recovered significantly since the DDT and mercury issues, which I will also talk about, but they're just such a beloved species in the Adirondacks, as I'm sure why most of you are here. And so it's one of those charismatic species that it's easier for people to get on board and make sure that we're doing the things that we need to environmentally in order to protect our wildlife. So they're also a biological indicator species. And what this means is, I kind of explained part of it, but that we can see those transitions as it's going up the food chain, and we can see how pollutants are accumulating, as well as the health of the overall system based on their success. So we know if the lake system is functioning at the highest level, if we have healthy and well populations of loons, essentially. So there are actually 5. The one that you're all familiar with is, of course, the common loon, and its breeding range is up here in the orange. And so you can see the typical range here. And then their migration, obviously, they kind of migrate south, as most birds do. And so the birds in this area tend to go more this way down the Atlantic coast, but then the ones in northern Canada will go down to the Gulf of Mexico. There's a really large breeding or wintering area there. And so that's the common loon. Then we also have the yellow-billed loon, which is predominantly in northern Europe and very small sections of Alaska. And then the Pacific loon, the Arctic loon, and the red-throated loon. So the red-throated loon is actually one that you can see in the Adirondacks, but it's not in its breeding territory. It's a bit further north. So the only time we see it is when it's migrating, and at that point, it doesn't have its breeding plumage. So it just looks like a little gray bird. So it's a little bit harder to recognize because it doesn't have that red throat, but it does breed or does migrate to this area. So most of the birds are a lot further north. The common loon goes the furthest south in the breeding territory. The loon is known as the feathered fish. So they're really interesting in that most birds are light and they have hollow bones, whereas the loon easily as well as get underwater quickly and swim fast. So it does have feathers, obviously, but it swims very, very well, hence the feathered fish. So getting into some of the things that we all love to see is chicks. So we're kind of going to go through, this presentation is conservation through the lives of loons. So we'll take each step and just see as they progress their lives, what they look like, how they act, what they do. So with chicks, when they first hatch, they are these tiny little brown puffballs, absolutely adorable. Spend a lot of time back riding on the parents to keep warm as well as to keep safe from predators and to sleep. They love to sleep on the backs. It's very cute. And then at 3 weeks, they transition into what we call the tick phase. They're just very like long, a little bit lighter brown. And then at about 9 weeks, they really start to get their full juvenile feathering, which is their plumage is more gray. And this is what you'll see later in the fall. And then obviously what we're all familiar with is the adult breeding plumage, which is that signature black and white beautiful bird that we all see and love to see. So the loon vocalizations, you'll have to bear with us for a second because we have some technology things.
I might be able to play them from here.
You think you want to give it a try?
I can try it. Let's see. Oh,
let's see how it goes.
Actually,
bear with us. All right, so there are different vocalizations that loons will do, and so I'm just going to go through and play them for you. And then, so the first one is the hoot. Let's see, I have to turn my phone off for do not disturb first. So this one, oh, we went to the next one. Don't listen to that. The hoot is a short distance communication call. So usually it's when you'll have a pair of adults and one will swim and dive and then pop back up and they'll say, oh, I'm over here. And so they're just kind of bopping back and forth. They're calm, they're not stressed, nothing's wrong. They're just talking back and forth. The next one I'm going to do is the whale. This is the one that most of you are probably familiar with. This is pretty much a signature loon call. And so this one is also not a distress call. It's a long distance communication. So oftentimes you'll have one mate that will go fishing on another lake or do something else, or especially if they have chicks and the mother says, I'm ready to go fishing now, come back. That's a lot of times what that call is going to be. So they will just do that to communicate between their pairs as well as with other loons, just vocalizing. Again, not a stress call, nothing to be concerned about. The next one is the tremolo. There are two different kinds of tremolos. I'm going to play it for you first. So this one is an alarm tremolo. So this is a stress call. This can be done by male and female loons, but it is essentially saying that they're stressed. Either something is too close, whether that be humans, loons, anything else. But then there is the other tremolo, and that one's a bit more higher pitched. And what that one is when there's a loon flying, it will make what's called a flight tremolo. And so it does sound very similar, but if you look to the sky and see a bird flapping along, it's a flight tremolo, and a lot of times they're just vocalizing to the lake below. And so that gives the loon, if there's another loon in that lake being territorial, they're able to say, don't come down here, this is my spot, and then they keep flying. So that is the tremolo, and then the yodel is the most stress call. That's not a happy loon. It's not that hard to pick that apart. So this one can actually only be done by the male, and this is a loon in the yodel position. So they get their heads really low to the water. They're very stressed, and they like I said, only males. This is a very territorial call. A lot of times if there's another loon invading their space, this is what'll happen. But again, humans, other things can stress out birds. Eagles, a lot of the times, especially if there's chicks, will cause loons to do this as well. And then the very cute ones, I actually have 2 chick calls for you. The first one is a loon chick begging for food, because we know that baby birds love to beg. And so that sounds like this, which you have to be pretty close to hear. So it's probably not one that a lot of you have heard. But that's just asking mom and dad for more food. Not that one. Like I said, bear with me. And then the next one is chick distress. So this is what's gonna get an adult to come back and see what's going on, because as that loon chick is becoming more independent, they tend to get a little more space, but this is how they can alert their parent that they're in danger or need something. And so that's what this one sounds like. That is loon vocalizations in a nutshell. So jumping right into things that are threatening these wonderful birds, there are obviously a lot of things that historically and currently threaten loon populations across the park, as well as in other regions for common loons. Some of the most common ones that we've researched and looked into include mercury pollution, acid deposition, climate change, water level fluctuations, lead poisoning from fishing tackle, fishing line entanglement, which we've actually already had 3 fishing line entanglement rescues this year alone. Disturbance of nests and chicks, either by humans or then we also have predators, shoreline development, and then catastrophic events, including oil spills, botulism, torrential downpours that flood nests, which happened a lot, 2 weeks ago. So there's a lot of things that do threaten these populations. Mercury is one of the biggest ones that we've been continuing to monitor as a research organization. So the toxic form of mercury is methylmercury. And so when this deposits into a watershed, again, because loons accumulate toxins, they continue to eat the little things that are getting the sediments that have methylmercury in them. And then as it continues to grow, they become at toxic levels for loons, which causes them to be ill and act in ways that they would not normally act. Males are a little bit bigger than females, which means they eat more than females, which means they tend to get sicker. Is the general difference between male and female there. And then, like I said, the adult behavior, they just tend to act a little ill. They'll be lethargic. They'll float up on shore, not necessarily doing the things that they should be doing. And then chicks, there's some issues with reproductive success. Also, females are actually able to get rid of some of the methylmercury that they have by laying their eggs, which also then affects the chick and the chick's ability to hatch and reproductive success in that sense as well. So, like I said, as you can see here, we're looking at the increase in mercury concentrations, and then this is the success of the hatching. So you can see as the concentrations of mercury increase, the reproductive success decreases. So this is something that we've been monitoring as an organization and through the Biodiversity Research Institute as well. And then one of the things that I get asked a lot is, where is the mercury coming from? There's a lot that we don't know about how long mercury stays in the system, but for the most part, we do know that it's traveling by wind and then getting deposited. Mountains are really good at trapping things, and so this region will get all of the wind and direction as it goes across. So we have the western United States, and you can see as it's going across, it's increasing as we get towards New England and then Brunswick, Florida. So west to east, the mercury concentrations are increasing. Now we have been curbing the emissions, and there was a law in, I think, 2010, I don't remember off the top of my head, that kind of tried to put a stop to this increase. And that has been fairly successful in stopping the mercury concentrations from rising, but it's kind of just plateauing. So there is some residence time with mercury in the atmosphere and within the sediments in the system. So it's still a potential effect, and we're still monitoring it when we're able. So like I said, we take a lot of samples. We take blood samples whenever we're able to. And part of this is for mercury as well as lead and other things, which I'll get into as our research. So our research is a lot of different topics are covered. We think about climate change, mercury, lead, as well as some other environmental factors like shoreline development, and the other things I mentioned at the beginning. But one of the ways that we are able to continue to monitor loons and find out more things about where they're migrating and things like that is through our capture and banding program. So we do 1 week of banding, which actually just finished on Sunday. So we just spent the last week banding a bunch of loons. And so we do some in the Adirondack Lake area, some in the Old Forge area. But the way that they're captured is at night, because and this is very common with most waterfowl, because they see and they swim so well that you don't have a chance during the day. They're just gonna fly away from you no matter what you do. So what we do on non-motorized lakes for the most part is we'll go out in a canoe. There'll be 3 people in the canoe. The person at the front has this really big light that spotlights it that you can see here, and that blinds them so they can't see anything. The person in the middle has a net, and then they're also playing calls. So the best way to get a loon is when it is like a pair with chicks, because then to get the adults to come in, you play chick begging calls, or you play chick distress calls, and then the adult loon will come right up to the boat. Or if you're trying to catch the chicks, you play the hoots, and then they come up to the, which it's really, really hard to hold loon chicks. It's just really traumatizing, you know, it makes me really sad to have to hold and stroke a little baby loon chicks. I recommend. So they have this net in the middle. So once they get close enough, they're able to net up the bird, and then the person in the back is just continuously paddling, getting all the fun. So that's how we are able to capture a lot of these. And we did band quite a few birds this last week. I don't have an exact number, but the night that I went out, we banded a male, a female, and we captured 2 chicks. We don't band the chicks, they're too small to be banded, so they just have to be held and pet. So like I said, we do band them. We have banding permits, and we also have veterinarians whenever we do these banding processes, so that all the precautions are taken. We're very careful with how these birds are held and interacted with. So as you can see here, this is what the bands look like. I'm going to go ahead and pass this around so you can look at it. This is how big their foot is. That is the accurate size. You don't really see their feet, but they get 2 bands. So they get a luminant band and colored band. That way we can identify them down to individual. And this is really useful because if you watch a loon for long enough, you'll notice that they do something called a foot waggle, and the leg will pop up, and then you get to see their bands. And this is one of the ways that we're able to continue to monitor and see that the same loon is coming back to the same place, because they have a red over green band, or they have a blue over yellow band. And so all these different colors really help us with our monitoring as well. And then we collect blood samples as well. And so these, again, we send off for analysis to find any pollutants or any issues that we want to be aware of. Avian flu is a big one right now that we're trying to keep an eye on, but mercury, lead, those sort of things too are also important. So we have a very large crew of field staff that's monitoring throughout the park. So we have our field staff, we're located in Adirondack Lake, New York, so a lot of our interns take care of those areas. But we also have paid field staff in other areas, including Old Forge and other places that are able to go out and monitor loons. And so through this, obviously, this is the foot waggle that I was mentioning, where they just pop their foot out of the water. It gives you a really good way to see the band. Sometimes we actually got a call this week that said there's what did they say? They said, oh, there's a jig stuck on this loon, and they sent me a picture, and I was like, oh, it's just a band, it's fine. So that is common. It's really hard to tell unless you have binoculars or like a really good camera, but it is a very common behavior for them to do that. And so we have these people out there who are monitoring and sending in their reports, and this is a great way for us to track that success as well as reproductive success, because we see when they had eggs, how many eggs they had, how many eggs hatched, how many chicks were able to survive. So we get all that information across the park, which is really useful in monitoring their populations. Here you can, so you see they have different bands on different legs. So this is blue over orange and blue over silver. So this is just another way that it's either wing rowing or preparing for takeoff. They breed on northern lakes, like we know. So you can also see essentially just the reproductive success. I don't have much to add on that. So in their breeding season, loons are very poor at walking on land. which is why their nests have to be so close to the edge of the water, and a lot of times, it's just so funny to watch. So another thing they'll do is to turn their eggs, and this is just to ensure that the egg is getting the same temperature and the embryos are developing fully. And abandoned nest. So we'll have somebody go out and mark a little X and pencil, and then if the egg gets turned, we know that the adult has been there. And if not, then we have someone collect it and freeze it, and we also ship those off for assorted analyses. So you got to see the egg in the nest there, but I'm also gonna pass around.
Oh.
This is the size of the egg, not the weight, but the size and the color that you'll be able to see. And they'll lay 1 to 3 eggs. 3 is very uncommon. A lot of times they'll lay 2, but sometimes they will lay 1. But most of the time, what we see is 2. The adults will incubate for 27 days. 26 and 28, so about 27. And during this time, they're very vulnerable. They're vulnerable to black flies, which they really don't like. They're vulnerable to eagles, especially groups of eagles will attack. So a lot of times they try and nest in areas that are more secluded, so that they have branches and cover and things like that. But they will alternate on and off the nest. Again, another reason why you might hear vocalization is come back, I'm hungry. So it happens. So the eggs are laid asynchronously, which means one is laid before the other. So that means they also hatch asynchronously. So when that happens, you have the first one tends to be the dominant chick. So it's a little bit bigger, it's a little bit stronger, and so there tends to be a bit of sibling rivalry. Mother Nature is not kind. Sometimes they will push off that second chick once they're established, and they'll peck at them and they'll get them pushed away from the family so that they can get all the food. So they do sometimes abandon their chicks, unfortunately, but it is a natural but sad process.
How many days apart do they?
Usually it's like 1 or 2. It's not too many, yeah. Yeah. So for the first few days, they're able to swim, they're able to do everything they need to do. They kind of start learning how to like peer in the water. They'll look down at their parents and see what's going on, how to catch a fish, and they'll start to get better and better at diving. It takes like 4 or 5 weeks for them to become pretty proficient in diving. And then once they're at like 9 to 11 weeks, that's when they're actually able to be independent and catching their own fish. It doesn't matter. They will still bother their parents to no end, and they will peck at them, and they really want food. Free food is the best kind of food, as we all know. And as you can see here, they have this gray plumage that I had mentioned at the beginning. So they look a little bit less like what we would characterize as a loon, but the juvenile loons we see for a very short amount of time before they leave for the coast. So a lot of times people don't know what they look like. Chick survival in the park has been decreasing a little bit in the last few years. We're not 100% sure why, but some of our theories are that the eagle population has rebounded significantly following the DDT stopping of use. And there's also issues with climate change, mostly regarding to flooding. When the nests are that close to the edge, a lot of times they'll get flooded out, and then you just won't have as many eggs being hatched. And if it's too late in the season, like it was this year, they won't be able to re-nest, which is something that they can do if they lose their eggs really early in the season. But right now, there's just not enough time for them to re-nest if that happened on their lake, which we know happened. I think Forked Lake was affected, and some other of the Essex chain of lakes as well was affected by this. So through our research, we're developing a mercury hazard profile and trying to determine what levels are influencing loons. So looking at the different types of things that we're looking at. So here, I don't have to read, here we have nesting, hatch success, chick survival, and overall productivity. And so what you can see here is this green bar is the lower mercury concentration, and the red bar is the higher one. So these are very similar. So nesting is very similar, so they're able to nest. But then once you start to look at hatch success, the birds with the higher mercury concentrations are doing a lot worse than the birds with the low mercury concentrations. And then chick survival again, and overall productivity. Chick survival is similar, but overall productivity, you can tell the birds with the higher mercury levels are doing worse in general. And as I mentioned here, you can see this is ignore the axes, this is the mercury concentration increasing over time. And then, as I said, they plateaued at about 2010 when we started curving those. So we haven't updated that in a few years, so hopefully they start to go down, but we are keeping an eye on that as well. So part of our job as an organization is to use the science and research that we are a part of and to inform policy. So we work with NYSERDA, and we also have national and global implications for how loons as well as other wildlife are managed. And so this is a great way for us to be involved at that level as well. In addition, we also inform the public, which is why we're here today. So my role is a fairly new role. It came about like maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So essentially what we want to do is use our community science programs, our monitoring, our field rescues, as well as all these presentations to just educate people about loons, how we can best care for loons and be stewards of the environment as well through that. And we also have this fun thing in Saranac Lake where we have this full event where you get to build ice. So we always advertise that because it's just a fun time. So interestingly, if you all remember the Buzzards Bay oil spill, I couldn't tell you what year off the top of my head, but it was in Cape Cod. And so this oil spill, as most oil spills do, led to large settlements. And so because we were tracking 3 loons with, we had satellite trackers in them, and we were able to see that they migrated and they were potentially in that area, we were actually able to get funding from the oil spill to run projects, because we could say that for sure Adirondack loons have used this area, could have been affected by this oil spill. But also oil spills also have a negative effect if they're directly in them, of course, as you can see with this very centered. And then botulism is another issue. There's actually several different types of botulism. So if you read about the ones in the West, those are different than the ones on the East Coast. But botulism is always an issue. It has been a little bit better in the last few years, but it is a potential that we're always trying to keep an eye on as well.
How do they contract botulism from anaerobic stuff on the bottom?
So one of them, I think that's, you hit me on that question. One of them is parasitic and one of them is bacteria.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I don't remember which is which. The other issue is commercial fishing bycatch. So this happens as well. Obviously, when they're migrating and they're in the ocean, they're a lot more subject to these than they are in the lakes. You know, up here, they're not getting that. But it is also an issue that we see. So loon migration is something that we like to continuously study. There actually wasn't a lot of research done about where specific birds are going until we started doing some tracking. So we have a very low sample size of what we were able to do. We only had 3 birds that we were able to tag, so take it for what it is. But it is a really fascinating interaction as well, and we've been seeing kind of a shift. Oh, here you can see, sorry, got ahead of myself. Here you can see what the transmitters look like. So we implant them. They're very, very, very short, but people think that they look like remote control birds. You know, the whole birds aren't real thing really comes out when you got a bird just sticking up with a little antenna, but that's what they look like. So like I said, we had 3 birds. One of them was a juvenile and 2 adults, I believe. And so these were the lakes that they were in. And then as you can see, there are migratory routes here. So this one that kind of came from ours, you know, went down coastal New York City and then went down into the New Jersey area. And then the ones that were with, I believe, Loon Preservation Committee did the New Hampshire ones, but they just went straight to Maine, straight off the coast. So it is a very taxing journey for them. They have to flap continuously. They are very heavy birds. They have dense bones, so they can't fly. They can't do anything. They have to continuously flap. It's very, very taxing. So they want to get to where they're going as fast as possible and then be done with it for the most part. And then one of our trackers died. This is going on my back. I'm sorry, it took me a second. One of the trackers died, not the bird, but the tracker itself. But we did find that they came back to the same lake. Oh, there it is. I knew I was looking at something. Boop. So yeah, as you can see here, they take the most direct route that they can. This one went a little bit further north. But we also noticed that one of the juveniles that we were looking at, on the way down, it stopped at like 6 lakes, whereas the adult just kept going. So he was getting a sightseeing tour, like wanted to see everything, make sure he didn't miss anything. The adult did not care. So this, you can see the little juvenile here, looks a little bit different, but again, it's a real bird. So yeah, so you can see it here. This is the adult in yellow, and then this is the purple one. You can see all the little stops he took before he got there. So that's pretty interesting. And we don't know if that's, obviously we don't know if that's a thing for all juvenile birds, but we do know that it can be really, really taxing as a journey. And obviously juvenile birds are not as strong as adult birds. So it is possible that they're taking those stops, and if those stops don't exist, then there's nowhere for them to go. And so here's where you can see the continuous flapping. It goes like that. It usually takes, it took the adult, I believe, 6 hours to get from the Adirondacks to New Jersey area is where it ended up. So it's fast. Yeah, they're going for it. So yeah, like I said, 6 hours. So we started at 10:49 and then went to 4:14 and it was done. And then again, just seeing this transmitter, it's a really interesting process, and the loons are very well cared for during this process as well. So we are very careful with how that is done, and there are at least 2 licensed veterinarians that are doing that. So, and our executive director is also a licensed rehabber as well. So geolocators are also sometimes used. We don't have a whole lot of these, but they do die after a certain period of time, but that's another technique that you can use to track where they're going. And then another way that we track loon populations is by doing the census, which just finished in July 15th. Did any of you participate? Yeah, which lake did you do? What lake? You did Lake George?
Yeah,
Awesome.
Lake George.
Yes, got one. I didn't know if I was gonna get one. So that's a program that I ran this year. We had a bit of a rough start with some things. We did have a lot of staff turnover. So we did get most of our data out and most of the forms out. And so far I've received, I think, 190 forms back. And so we had signups for over 350 water bodies, which is probably around 500 volunteers. So that's a pretty average turnout for us. But at some point you do reach a peak of what people are able to access. As some of the ponds and lakes that you can do, you'd have to hike in 10 miles with your boat to go do them. So there is only so much that we can do, but it is a really fun event and it gets everyone involved in them as well. We also use nest cameras. We set these up to see what predation is happening as well as some other things. Obviously, you can see that this is a nice heron that wasn't bothering the loon at all. There's sometimes they just make friends and sometimes they don't like them. So as you can see here, we got a beaver and the loon's just chilling. But this is a loon diving off the nest, so it was threatened something got too close. And then there's just a loon up top with 1 chick. So this, you can see that they've laid 1 egg and then the other one hasn't laid yet on that top picture. And this is how we found that some animals that we didn't know liked eggs. So bears will eat them, raccoons, otters, sometimes, not often, but sometimes. There's just a large variety of things that will happen upon an egg and take it. Of course, humans are also a threat, as we all know. This was taken from first nest camera I think we put up, and you can see that you got a poor loon here on a nest and just a bunch of people all around him. It's actually interesting that his head or her head is up. So usually they get, and I do the next slide, no, it's not. When they get really panicked on a nesting situation, they put their head really low to the ground so they can dive into the water easier. And I'm sure it will be on a future slide. So I'm getting ahead of myself again. Sorry, got excited. Another thing that we do, as I said at the beginning, we're also getting more into management. This includes putting up loon nesting sites as well as nest rafts. And so we try to put up some buoys in areas where people are not leaving the birds alone. And we do this, we do use these to some discretion because sometimes when you put up a buoy, it actually attracts more attention than not. But if it's in a high trafficked area, it usually doesn't hurt to get a buoy up, and hopefully people will avoid it a little bit more. Like I mentioned, with climate change, water level rise is also an issue. With the shallow nature of the nest, you can see here, this was at 6:11 p.m. And then by the next morning, the nest is gone. There's nothing we can really do about that. So that's one of the reasons that we try and implement the floating nests when possible. Oh, here we go. This is the loon in the hangover position. So it gets really stressed out. It also will look like it's panting a little bit. Its mouth is, you can't see it in this picture, but sometimes its mouth will open a little bit and it looks like it's panting essentially. And so we've also gotten calls that there's a dead loon, but it's not a dead loon, they're just too close and it's laying down in its nest. Unfortunately, if the loon continues to feel threatened and then dives off its nest, because they're a little clunky on land, they can also knock the eggs off the nest, and so then you also lose potential chicks as well. So if you ever see a loon in this position, something is too close or you are too close, back away. So this is a nest. They actually will form various size nests. So some of them are pretty small. They can be like this big, and sometimes they get really big. It's just whatever pile of sticks they feel like putting together. But this one, as you can see, is in a bit of a shallow water area. So the nest traps that we put up varying types. Sometimes we'll put up ones that don't have what we call an avian guard, which is the thing that goes over top. A lot of times we found that putting up the one that's flat initially will help them get acclimated to it, and then you can put up the avian guard, but getting into that cramped space can sometimes scare them a little bit when they're just getting used to it. However, I will say that sometimes you'll put a raft right next to like where they nest, and you know it's gonna get flooded or they haven't had success. They don't care. They just look at it and they're like, oh, that's a nice place. I'm gonna go over here. And then you can't predict what they're gonna do, but we have had a lot of success with the ones that do use the floating rafts. So if they are able to transition to that, they tend to do pretty well. Things that do not make them do pretty well is lead tackle. So our lead tackle buyback program, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is one of the ways that we're tackling this. So as you can see here, lead tackle and anything with lead in it, lead pellets affect eagles a lot more as well, but any wildlife, lead is very, very toxic, and any amount essentially ingested can kill them, even a healthy adult loon. And so this is a really big issue that we are trying to change in the state of New York. You cannot sell lead tackle, but you can use lead tackle. So we encourage you not to use lead tackle, but it is a prevalent issue, and a lot of times when we do, oh my goodness, I keep saying that. When we do necropsies, we will find several that have had lead poisoning. So it is still an issue. So the lead tackle buyback program is a really great program that was funded by that oil spill that I mentioned. And what it does is we partner with local bait shops throughout the park, and they offer vouchers for people to turn in a certain amount of lead tackle. They can only get one voucher, but it gives them $10 for non-lead tackle. And then once they purchase that, and most likely they purchase other things as well while they're there. Once that bait shop at the end of the year, we collect all of their vouchers and we reimburse them for everything through that grant. So they make money off of it, they get publicity off of it, because obviously we tell everyone and publicize where they are. I think we're actually missing our new ones on here. There's one in Teresa, New York, which is not close to you. And then there's one in Caroga Lake, which is the Canada Lake Marine. But we have found that it's a lot harder for us to approach bait shops. We get hung up on a lot, as I was telling Abby earlier. So it is a lot better to approach it from a local angle. So we try and get our loon-friendly lake programs and some of our local field staff and interns to go into bait shops and talk to them at that perspective. So if you know someone, or if you're willing to go talk to your local bait shop and just suggest, hey, have you heard of this? You can make money off of it. That'll probably go over better than me trying to call it. Cold calling does not work very often. That's it for my sales pitch. Okay, so the fishing line entanglement problem, like I mentioned, we have had several rescues this year. One of them unfortunately died, but we did get the other one freed and got away. So that was really great. And that was up on Star Lake actually. So in response to that, we created the fishing line recycling program. And essentially what that does is we have these giant, oh no, still more tackle, still more. Oh, that was a great, yeah, I think that's on all of our brochures because it hurts your eyes to look at. There's more. So this is a rescue. Sometimes when they're really, really hard to catch, these ones too, because if they're in a pair or have chicks, they can still be caught easily, like I talked about with the other night lighting procedures. But if they're a bachelor or a single lady, they're not coming anywhere close to your boat. So they can be really hard to catch until they become really sick, or if they're not able to move for some reason or not able to fly. But a lot of times they're still able to fly. It's just when they begin to swallow it or try and get it out, they feel that there's a long line, and so they like whip their heads around, and that's how you get the continued spinning and spinning. There we go. This is what I was looking for. So it's this giant PVC thing, and we give you all the materials for this, but we have a lot of lake owners that will put them up at beaches and at boat launches and things like that. So you just essentially zip tie them up to a pole, and then if someone finds fishing line, they can just put it in. And then we actually send it off to this facility in Iowa that is able to recycle fishing line. It's a one-of-a-kind facility. There's nowhere else you can send fishing line. And so it's a great program that allows for us to get rid of that. So like I mentioned, we do also complete loon rescues, and this has become increasingly challenging in the last few years because the ice has been variably thin, and we cannot rescue loons. As you can see, this one, obviously, this was during one of our ice rescues. So due to the low ice levels, as well as the overnight freezes that you can see, some birds will end up getting stuck. Usually this is juvenile birds because they don't know what's going on, but the adults will also get stuck if they think that they can stay at this lake. They're like, oh, it's not freezing yet, so maybe I can stay here and continue fishing, and then overnight they get stuck. It takes them so long to take off. It takes them almost 400 meters to take off. So, and that's why if you've ever seen a loon take off, they're just like really going for it all the way down the lake on their runway. So once they get iced into a small spot, they can't go anywhere, they get stuck, and so we have to rescue them if we are able to get there safely. But we also do the fishing line entanglements. So these are juvenile loons that are stuck on ice. This, I believe, was our ice rescue training. And then you can see there's one that's molted before it's able to fly away. So then it's stuck on that lake and can't fly either. So there's a lot of different things that are affecting their ability to migrate. So one of our future plans is to create a better facility for loon rescues, because right now we only have a few licensed rehabbers who are able to travel throughout the park for these purposes, and one of them is our lovely director, is Nina. And so we would like to create a more central facility in Newcomb was the original plan, so hopefully they're able to recover from all the flooding, but this would be a more centralized rehab station for people. Once we have rescue teams throughout the park that are trained, then they can bring them to Newcomb and have them in one place for potential rehab and release as well. So the Loon Friendly Lake Certification Program is another one of our programs. And if you're interested in this, I did leave some brochures in the back if you want to pick one up and look at it as well, just so you know. But what this program is it's a community-based education stewardship program, and it's a cooperation between us, and we essentially train you to help the loons on your lake. And so we currently have 40 lakes, I think, participating to some degree. Last year, I think we only had 17 or 18 complete the certification. So there's certain things that we ask each lake to do in order to achieve that certification and become a loon friendly lake. One of those things is putting up these signs with the fishing line receptacles that I showed you. We also do presentations throughout the summer. So we've already done a series in June, and July was last week. In August, we're talking about migration. I think they're Zoom presentations, August 15th and 17th. If you're interested in those, you're welcome to sign up on our website. And then we also have, oh no, I'm wrong. August is threats to loon conservation. September is migration. So we have two others that are upcoming as well, and those are all listed on our website on the events page as well.
And the website is your website, not
Yes.
this, not this
Yes.
location. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's abkloon.org.
Okay.
And so we get asked a lot, what can you do? So there are some things that we can't control, obviously, but there are the little things like collecting fishing line, using alternatives to lead tackle, staying away and keeping space. And if you see someone harassing a loon, we also ask you to report it either to us or to DEC. There are DEC officers that will, if they are continuing to harass, go out and try and find the person. For example, we had a paddle boarder who went too close and knocked an egg off a nest, and there's only so many paddle boarders on that lake, so the DEC officer was able to find him and find him. So there is some things that we can do to try and help. And obviously look for chicks if you're in a motorized vessel as well, and give them a wide berth because they do not dive very well, especially when they're just little guys. We have a lot of support. We're supported through grants. Helps us to complete our work. Some of the most important ones are the V120 oil spill, which is on behalf of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So local organizations to and do various activities throughout the region. And like I said, many, many supporters. Actually, Dr. Mark Woodcrest is, he works at Tufts. He's a professor at Tufts University. He's a veteran. He will be our speaker for the Loon celebration, which is at Paul Smith's College. So if you're around October 8th, you should check out the Loon celebration as well. I can only have so many cells in the presentation. See if this, oh, is that not gonna work?
Oh, a video,
Yeah.
I can get it.
How much time do we have?
6:19.
Sorry.
I think this is for, yeah, we're, should be able to, this is the last thing, I promise. And then you can ask as many questions as you want. Let's see if we can get it to work. This is a video. Oh, is it up? So yeah, this was a video made by Kurt Gardner, who went out with us last year, and he also went out with us this year to do some loon banding. So it just lets you see kind of the process of us. So this would be when we're serving, during the day, our banding crews will go out and find where the loons are, where the nests are, so that we can better catch them at night, because obviously you can't see anything at 8 a.m. So you can see here, that's the front of the boat, and it's spotlighting. And so if the loons don't know what to do, you can see that little chick in the back too. Oh. I say he, but you can't really tell them apart except for size. So we found that the best way, it's not hurting them to hold them by their neck, and if you don't, they have a beak that will. So it really is the best way to secure them, so we hold them by that. And then this is pre-measuring before you put the bands on, so it can be the correct size, so you don't have to, so it doesn't fall off of them, but it also isn't too tight on them when they're flying and swimming. And then taking the sample, blood sample. And avian flu and other potential. And then we also do measurements of assorted things of beak length, overall size. Yeah. Yep. So just making sure that the band isn't sharp and then putting it on. It's very relaxing. So they're also numbered as well. Just in case like one falls off or something like that, and we want to know where it came from, which I don't think it's happened, but you gotta be cautious. So like I said, 2 bands on each leg to help identify the correct combination, and then this is the weighing process. So we'll weigh them, and then we take them out and we weigh the bag and the towel as well. Putting the towel over their head just helps calm them down. They can't see, so they're not as stressed out by what's going on around them. They'll also get really hot throughout this process, body temperature wise, especially the males. So they lose their heat and gain heat through their feet. So we will put them on ice packs as well that we have to try and keep that from being too much of a stressor on them. And then with the males, we usually just let them go if they're close enough to where we were banding. If there's a female and chicks, we try and bring them back to sort of where their nursery area was. But then they just swim right off. There's No anesthetic, nothing like that. They just are held and then released when we're done. Yeah. Before any questions, I just wanted to ask that you pass this around. This is our mailing list, so for email. So if you want to receive what it is, I promise it's not spam. It's once a month. We just talk about random loon facts, some of our upcoming events and presentations and things like that. Please feel free to do so. If not, just pass it on. And then feel free to visit us at any time in Saranac Lake. We have a new storefront that is up compared to the last 2 years. If you've been up there in a while, we moved. So it's a really great building, and we're starting to do some exhibit design, work on completing some of our grants. We have a few that we should have new exhibits up by the spring. So, any questions? Yes.
Is the breeding range, is that temperature dependent, and if things get warmer, will that mean that the breeding range is gonna move north?
They could shift. It's really hard to predict, honestly. Yes, I mean, and essentially, yes, it is temperature and also the environment itself. They really do need the clear water lakes to dive best and get what they need. So it'll be impossible to tell until we see more of the effects of what that's gonna be. I know that's always what people say about climate change, but we're only able to know so much. And loons have been relatively not, like, we're the only organization that's done loon research, and we don't have a lot of data from the movements of them. Like I said, we had the 3 transmitters and we monitor, so we don't have quite enough information to make that sort of assertion. Yes.
So they have 2, sometimes 3 eggs, but only once a season?
So they can re-nest. So most of the time they have 2, 3 is very, very rare. But if early enough in the season, they have predation from an eagle or their nest floods or something happens, they knock an egg off the nest, they can re-nest. So usually they nest in late May, early June, so then they're hatching in July typically. So if they lose the eggs in mid-June, they can re-nest, and then they just have their eggs a little bit later in late July. But if it gets too late in the season, they don't re-nest, because they know it's not worth it. And then as Nina likes to say, they just go off and have a good time and go to cocktail parties. Yeah.
Do the loons stay with the same partner? Do they?
That's a good question. I didn't cover that. So it's actually a common misconception that they mate for life. They don't. They could. They can if they want to. If the male doesn't get pushed off the territory, they can mate happily for the rest of their lives. But if a new loon comes in and pushes off either the pair or the male, the female will just change pairs. So if they continue going back to the same lake out of convenience, they will. But they don't necessarily have to, like some species do. That's a good question. Yes.
How is the loon population on Lake George? Do you know, is it increasing, decreasing? Is it more common in north and south?
I think it's been relatively stable. I don't know the Lake George numbers off the top of my head. I do know that the census data has already been submitted because I just received an email like 2 hours ago, so I can't give you the most up to date. But in general across the park, and I think this also applies for Lake George, we're seeing a slight increase in adults and a slight decrease in chicks. Yes.
Have you got any new grants for new satellite tracking?
I don't believe so. Yeah, I think we're always looking for research grants, and there's only so much we're able to do. We are a small organization. We have 5 permanent staff, so yeah, but we're always looking. Sure. There. No. Okay,
How many loons do you have, just on Lake George, how many loons?
Oh, that would
idea, like, what?
Well, that would be better. Who did the census on Lake George?
Well, the census on Lake George is
Yeah.
many people.
Right. Oh, okay. There was a
So
final form
we only
submitted.
had, Roger Slide and the
Uh-huh.
Type 100 over beach,
Yeah.
which is what, a couple miles? That's
Yeah.
only covered in an hour, and we found one.
Yeah. I think there was. I know the final literally got sent to me like an hour
No,
ago.
maybe
So
like that, didn't you do
There was only
last
one
year?
last year reported.
it's possible. I think the numbers are relatively.
It rained, I think, last year.
I looked at the census you're
Yeah.
referring to. from
Yeah,
last year,
the
there was
census-
one on the whole of Lake George.
Yeah, the
It was
twenty
reported.
twenty-two data
Right.
is up on our website too. I just don't know the number off
I
the
know
top of my
that
head.
rain didn't go out,
So somebody just said
This
they're
used to
filming
be
the
a
no,
one.
last year. And then the year before
They're
that.
on
it was
Lake
super
George.
windy.
There's definitely more than
So
one.
it's gonna be scary.
More than-
Yeah.
And you also, it's good for the interior area as well. And I also say that Lake George, but
And then we've done.
I think people would think that there would be more than there just because it's of it, but you also have to have pros and a risk of motor vessels as well, and some of this is bigger. But you look on the website, there's a table, it's a little of the census numbers from this year.
Is it, well, which lake in the Adirondack, do you know, has the most loons or the?
For some time, I mean, like Lake Clear in the fall, for some reason, gets a ton of migratory. So at the end of the season, when they're no longer with chicks or you have a bunch of bachelor adults, they tend to group up because they can do social feeding and just for protection. And so for some reason, we're not sure why, but Lake Clear can have hundreds of loons all over it. And so that's where we do our guided paddles in October as well. And so that's the one off the top of my head that I can tell you.
I just got a message in the chat. Apparently there were 10 loons reported last year for Lake George.
There we go. Thank you.
That was Julie.
There's a lot more than that.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it was, like I said, that was about a
Migration,
year for going out.
Some, remember these, they overwinter, many overwinter, but some actually go to Florida, is that correct?
Some may go to Florida. Almost all of them migrate, especially common loons. They do have to migrate. For the most part, we think that the ones in our area tend to go towards the Atlantic coast, and the ones in our, again, our 3 sample size, were coastal New Jersey, New York City area, and Cape Cod. And so it is also likely impossible if they're going down towards, South Carolina, North Carolina, the southern Atlantic coast. They could also be going to the Gulf of Mexico though. Again, we just don't have the bigger sample size, but we do think that the ones that are in Canada, like Saskatchewan, there have been a few studies that there's a national loon center in Minnesota, so they do some studies as well. And those ones tend to go to the Gulf of Mexico. So that,
Have ice rescues, that was not during the winter?
the ice rescues are, they're when like there's quick freezes. And so it's usually in like December when they haven't left yet, if something hasn't frozen and they get stuck, is typically what it is. There's also times when they're migrating and they'll accidentally land on ice thinking that it's water, or they'll accidentally and land on roads thinking that it's water because it's dark. And they get really injured from that because when they land like this essentially, and so it just hits them really hard, and so usually they have some injuries. So there's a lot of reasons for rescues throughout the summer and throughout the rest of the season. Yeah.
If you see 3 loons together, it's normally a male and a female and a chick or what?
If it's small, it's probably a male and a female and a chick, but it could also just be 3 adults. If they don't have a chick, they're not necessarily as territorial, and so they might just be social feeding and helping out, but sometimes they'll end up in groups. I know I've been watching a group there's like 4 or 5 of them, and they'll be social feeding and hanging out, and then one of them will eat the other one's fish, and then they'll be going at it for a second. It's hard to tell. If they're small, yeah, it's probably a chick, but if it's a normal adult loon, they could just be chilling. That's this.
But when you mention 1, 2, or even 3 eggs, and yet we can see one going by with 4 little chicks, often. Would that be a grouping thing? But it's only.
Is there
the parent.
two adults? Is there multiple adults? I don't think I've ever heard of loons
Well,
combining, like mergansers or like other ducks, you can like chuck a
yeah, that's true.
duckling in and hope for the best, hope they join up, but I don't done it before, it's really fun.
Not seeing them go by?
Yeah,
So you mentioned you didn't mention what they eat, fish. Do they have a particular fish? Are they happy with any fish they catch or?
yeah, so they'll pretty much eat any fish that they can fit in their mouth. And then they'll also eat invertebrates. They do have to change their diet a little bit when they go to the ocean to what's more available depending on where they are. And another thing that I didn't mention about when they migrate, there's so much information to cover, is that they obviously have to adapt to freshwater versus saltwater. So like many other birds, they do have salt gland in their nose, which allows them to secrete the salt. And so in the summer that atrophies, but then when they've gone to the salt water, they have to, you know, get that working again. And then they're able to adjust to that.
Their plumage is different, they're,
Yeah, they have a winter plumage, so once they get there, they molt to that non-breeding plumage. And they look great, they look very similar to juveniles, just bigger.
You said that you were one of the few centers or like the only, are you the only one in the Adirondacks? How many,
Yeah.
like, are there in general? Do you know that?
So we're the only ones in the Adirondacks. The other big one is Loon Preservation Committee, which is based in Boltonboro, New Hampshire. They've done a lot of really great work in New Hampshire. And then the other main one is the National Loon Center, which is in Minnesota. Those are the three in North America. Yeah. So it is a pretty niche field. Yeah.
You answered it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So we're in a small lake, and we've had a pair of loons for about 10 years, and then they usually have 2 chicks. But the following year, there's always just 2 loons. So where do the chicks go? What
Yeah.
happens there?
So the juveniles stay in the ocean for 2 to 3 years.
Oh.
They don't actually immediately come back. So they, again, this will be covered in our migration lectures. But good question. So the juveniles, once they're able to migrate, they will go, and we do actually think that they set up non-breeding territories as well. So if they, you know, migrate to Florida, they tend to go back to Florida once they're used to that. But they're not as defensive or anything like that. They just continue to go back to the same place. Anyway, so the juveniles will stay there for 2 to 3 years, and then they'll come back. So they do generally come back to a similar area, but they might not come back to the exact same lake. If there's room for them, they will. But if the territory is already claimed, a lot of times the younger adults are not able to fend off the more hardy loons, so they'll just try and find a nearby lake to go to.
Yeah, it's a small lake, so.
Yeah, so they're probably taking that territory, and they're not gonna give it to any of their old children. It depends. It depends on how closed off it is. A lot of times it'll be like a cove or something like that. It's not necessarily a size, but more like what they can protect and defend is how I would put it. So I don't have an exact size for you, but if it's, you know, a lake with 3 coves that are opposite of each other, even if it's a small lake, they can all, you know, agree that this is mine, this is yours, this is yours, and there's less fighting. Or if there's like for, again, Little Lake Clear, they have, like, there's an island pair, and then there's a pair down in another cove, and then down in a northern cove. So they all kind of spread out naturally, but they need that shoreline that allows them to nest is the main thing that they're looking for. So even if there's a bunch of lake space, it doesn't mean they're gonna take it, just because they need that nesting habitat, and they need various things to protect themselves as well. So, yeah.
Will they nest around other birds?
No, not usually. There aren't usually other birds that are nesting where they nest. Again, like the most common thing is eagles, and they're not on the ground, but they're in the same areas, and they can sometimes be affected by that. But there's not a whole lot of, I think that they generally will keep the other like ducks and things away from where they are. I think they're the bigger bird. As you can see here, they're a big bird. Yeah, they're pretty intimidating. Yeah. Other questions? Are there any in the chat?
No, it's just
Okay.
the 10 loons.
I think we're probably out of time.
Yes, it's 6:36.
Oh, yeah, we are.
Yeah.
But I'll be around for a little longer if you have questions.
Thank you for coming. If you want to refer back. If you want to refer back to this, we'll have the YouTube video posted hopefully by tomorrow, with the Zoom calls and everything.
And the loon calls are all on your website. I'm gonna go back and not hear from my phone.